International Governance Innovation. So our discussions are going to begin today with some brief introductions from the deans of our Engineering and International Affairs School. So let me begin by welcoming Dean John Lach, who's the Dean of GWU's School of Engineering. John?
Thank you, Susan, and thanks so much for inviting me to help kick off this wonderful event. As Susan said, I'm Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science here at GW. I've been here for about 4.5 years now, and it's actually events like this and wonderful collaborations that resulted in things like TRAILS, the Trustworthy AI and Law and Society Institute, that brought me to GW in the first place. When I was first approached about the opportunity to become dean here, it was, you immediately start going into that strategy mode of like, okay, well, what are the things we could do as a school that would really be impactful and help take the school to the next level? And it was things like this. And so learning about the kinds of things that our faculty do and that our students are interested in. So GW historically is not known as an engineering school. It's certainly not the first thing people think of when they hear GW. So I kind of initially, when I arrived, really talked to the faculty and the students and said, well, why did you come here? Why did you come here to study engineering or to teach engineering, to research engineering? And it was because of the opportunity to create the kind of partnerships that resulted in things like the TRAILS Institute. So it's what we now call throughout the engineering school, engineering and ... And it's all these different ways that our students and our faculty and our alumni fill in that blank after the and. And so around something like AI, I mean, the reality is that every single engineering school and computer science department in the world is going big in AI, right? It's the next big thing. So how can GW Engineering kind of carve out its space and really be a leader and make an impact in this field? And it's by these kinds of partnerships, working with Susan, working with people in the law school, our business school, our school of public health, public policy, all of that, to really look at that intersection of the technological innovations that are happening around AI with all of the social science dimensions of it, including policy and data governance and all these really, really important things. And so it's with that kind of thought leadership of our faculty and the way that they're working together that made something like TRAILS possible. For those of you who aren't aware of TRAILS, this is one of the new the new AI institutes funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's in partnership with the University of Maryland and also Morgan State University. And it really is looking at that intersection, as the name implies, of the relationship between AI and law and society and how that relates to trust and trustworthiness as we're developing and deploying these kinds of technologies. How does that relate to our ability to trust them, and which will of course impact how we use the technology and how we should govern the technology and the associated data. So it's really, really exciting for me to see something like this come together here, and I'm so grateful for the faculty and the students around GW and all of our partners around the greater DC area to come together and work on this on these types of projects. I mean, when I talk to our alumni and I talk to parents and all of those things, and we talk about AI, I mean, there's always the inevitable questions about the core technological issues, but it always ends up going into more issues of like, well, what are the concerns? What are the risks? And how do we mitigate those kinds of risks? And how do we create sensible governance policies around them? And so it's wonderful to see GW be leading that conversation. And so in this meeting that you're having today is a great example of that. So welcome, excited to have you here, excited to have engineers and computer scientists be a part of these conversations as well. It takes a holistic approach for sure, everybody coming together to have these kinds of discussions and figure out what really is the best path forward around data governance in the age of generative AI. So welcome. Thanks again.
Our next speaker is my colleague, Nick Vonortas, who's Associate Dean of the Elliott School. And he is also, this guy has more hats than I have fingers. He has appointments in Russia, in Brazil.
Russia is gone.
Oh, okay. It is gone, but okay.
It finished the 24th of February, 2022. That particular day. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to the organizers of this event. It's a great privilege for me to be here. I want to continue on Dean Lach's remarks. This is exactly what GW is good at. The location of the university is fantastic for these kinds of things. If you want to influence policy, for example, this event, I am truly happy to see the room packed because I know the discussions here will be fantastic. And it comes actually on the heels of yet another great event in which Susan participated, and the Trails Institute had a very prominent place, which was carried out last Thursday and Friday. It will shortly be online. You will be able to see it all. That was the Athens Roundtable, the AI in the era and the rule of law. Right, and rule of law. So Trails was very much part of this. Tremendous success, tremendous event. 5 members of Congress addressing the audience, the president of the university, and so forth. So this is just the follow-up. I mean, not diminutive, but is just following up because both events were basically organized in parallel. I mean, about the same time. Yeah. And what is important for me is that data is one of the cornerstones of artificial intelligence, right? I mean, artificial intelligence would never be here if we didn't have this torrent of data that we have seen more recently. I don't know how many of you, if anyone, has seen the article by Ian Bremmer and Mustafa Suleiman in Foreign Affairs of the last issue, September, October. It is on the AI power paradox. And in that article, which actually I had my students read for the cornerstone class that ended 2 nights ago, in the end, it says the following. The following is the message. Any governance framework of AI will need to be precautionary, agile, inclusive, impermeable, and targeted. 5 principles. Based on those principles, and all of those actually are of interest to data and data governance as well. So based on those, policymakers should create, I'm reading, at least 3 overlapping governance regimes. The first is for establishing facts and advising governments on the risks posed by artificial intelligence. Facts means data, right? The second is for preventing an all-out arms race between the different countries and basically China and the US right now. And the third one, for managing the disruptive forces of a technology unlike anything the world has seen. Right before. So in closing, I think this event will be fantastic, and I'm looking really forward to the discussions. Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you very much.
Okay, so I too have some brief remarks to get us going and sort of to set the parameters. Okay, so we're only talking about one kind of AI here, and that is generative AI. And generative AI is a technology rife with challenges for policymakers, right? First of all, we don't have any reliable statistics on the use of generative AI chatbots, but we do have some anecdotal evidence that around the world, individuals and firms increasingly use these large language models to receive, analyze, and create new forms of information. So instead of us going to our browsers or our libraries, we are going we're going to chatbots. Yet, because many of these systems are proprietary, Their algorithms, models, and data sources are not transparent. Often, outsiders can't utilize scientific methods to replicate these models that underpin generative AI, and in so doing, build trust in those systems. Moreover, the world knows very little about, except for in open systems, about the sources of that data, data provenance, right? And whether such data sets are accurate, complete, and representative. Finally, only a few companies have the staff with the expertise, data science, computer science, computing power, which everyone today will just say compute, and the large data sets needed to build, explain, expand, and improve the models that underpin this technology. As a result, generative AI is not only going to change where and how people get information, but it could be dominated by a few giant data companies that control the use and reuse of much of the world's data. Now, there are some governments that don't like that, and they're trying to push open source, and we'll see where that goes. And I'm talking about France and Germany as example. But in general, policymakers have responded to this challenge in what I'd call a piecemeal or ad hoc fashion. They focused on addressing data by type, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? Personal data it's very important that we protect personal data. But they haven't thought systemically about the mix of data that underpins generative AI systems, or about who remains unprotected under current data governance rules. What do I mean by unprotected or underprotected? Content creators, as example. Okay, they also have not addressed the legality of web scraping as a means of building large language model data sets. So these data sets, please feel free to sit right there, please. These data sets are built on data scraped from around the world, right? Given that data, the internet is a shared global resource, in which some people call commons. We'll see what Angie has to say about that. But because she's from the Ostrom workshop, which is Eleanor Ostrom's work was to teach us about commons. But in any case, web scraping helps keep the internet healthy, right? We need web scraping, but we also need to understand if it is legal when data flows from one country to another country to build those data sets. We've already seen temporary bans, right, of ChatGPT. I'm looking at you, Italy, and lawsuits in the United States related to the alleged misuse of data. We may soon see trade disputes. Finally, policymakers have not focused sufficiently on the importance of establishing data provenance and transparency as a means of ascertaining if the data sets underpinning large language models are accurate, complete, and representative. Now, just all I'm saying here is if you and I are increasingly using chatbots to get information, and we know from time to time, those chatbots hallucinate. And why do they hallucinate? Could be the fault of the design. Also could be a problem of the accuracy, the completeness, and representativeness of the data sets. So over the next 2 days, we'll discuss some of these issues that I brought up today. We're not going to be talking about trade probably. And maybe, just maybe, our speakers and our panelists will come up with some good ideas to get policymakers thinking. So here's how it's going to go down. Each panel is going to encompass 35 to 40 minutes of discussion, and then we're going to make sure that you have 35-ish minutes to engage with them. As MC, I'll try to keep us on a tight schedule. At the end of the day, we're going to use Unanimous AI, which is an AI company that essentially uses consensus AI, a form of AI, swarm AI, to use that platform to discuss some of the ideas that we come up with and try to find a consensus on them. Maybe we will have some great ideas. So let's start now with panel 1, which is moderated by Dr. Cody Bunton. And Cody is a professor of information studies at the University of Maryland, and here he comes. And so take it away, Cody. He's going to introduce our panelists. And here are the questions again. Does anybody on the panel need the questions? Okay,
Yeah, I'll keep it.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and moderate this esteemed panel with some amazing colleagues. This thing. I'm going to borrow this briefly. Oh, no, that one works now. Okay. Right, so it's my esteemed pleasure to welcome Dr. Teresa Scassa, Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa, Dr. Jen King, Privacy and Data Policy Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, and Dr. Alex Hanna, Director of Research for Distributed AI Research Institute and co-host of the podcast Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000. So, Susan was very clear that I must remain on time to give you all the opportunity to hear from our panel and then interact with them. So I'm going to jump right in to the questions. I'm going to set the timers so Susan doesn't throw anything at me.
I've got little things on that.
Perfect. Here we go. Question 1. AI developers depend on 2 primary data sources for constructing large language model data sets: proprietary data and data scraped from the web. Question to the panel: what are the dangers in relying on these 2 sources of data? Whoever wants to.
I'll go in. Hello, hi, thanks for having me. Okay, so the question says the dangers of using proprietary data and data scraped from the web. So when we talk about proprietary data, we're thinking about the different data caches that are utilized by different tech companies, right? When you go on Google, you go on TikTok, Instagram, Meta, whatever, they're collecting many different data traces on you. So we're thinking about in different spheres. Let's constrain the technology to generative AI just to make the example a little more tractable. And so focusing on something like social media data, you can think about that as every comment you've typed, every image you've uploaded, everything, whatnot. Meta has also been shown to actually also collect data that you've deleted, or rather, you start typing a comment and it gets deleted. That's also data that they have. And so if you're thinking about developing models or having models as that are intended to be accountable, testable, susceptible to different kinds of scientific inquiry, having proprietary data doesn't allow any kind of openness around this. You're basically having a situation in which companies are accruing, one of their main powers coming from the data caches that they have in their stores. But there's no way of testing anything about those data, testing and allowing scientists in any kind of open community to navigate and discern where these things are going wrong. So that's what the proprietary data, the most alarming thing. In terms of the data scrape for the web, and I mean, I think this is probably where we're going to spend most of our time today, because a lot of the data that comes into large language models in particular are data that is scraped from the web. There are multiple different problems. There are problems that first come with the problems of copyright and any kind of intellectual property rights that are gained for actual web content. So this is currently being litigated on different fronts. George R.R. Martin, Jodi Picoult, Sarah Silverman, many people have been are going after OpenAI in a current suit that's focusing on one of the data sets being used in this, which is called Books 3, although Books 3 has been used in different kinds of guises. There's many different data sets that have been using copyrighted data. One of the most famous is Common Crawl. And I think Washington Post did a really good article basically identifying all the different places in which Common Crawl data have actually had explicit copyright notices. The status is actually using copyrighted data as legible or actually open ground for training AI is actually kind of in discussion right now. It's under litigation. It's still an open area. Companies have said according to, and I'll let Jen talk about this more because I'm not not a lawyer, but like the kind of the 4-factor test in terms of determining whether something is quote fair use. Is the companies arguing that the first test is that they're sufficiently transformative. However, many, especially creators, have argued that the 4th criteria, that it is not infringing on market competition, is it violates that one. So still being litigated. So that's number 1, copyright. Number 2 are privacy dangers, notably in kind of re-identification. There was a paper that was put out by Google recently that basically said one of the adversarial tests that you could offer to ChatGPT is that you repeat a word frequently enough, and it will identify, release PII, or it will release training data, of which PII, personally identifiable information, is one of them. There's also existing work by Nicholas Carlini, who's also a researcher at Google, that's shown that also happens. And this is only in the case he was able to actually detect this because he used an open source data set called in an open source model, an open source data set called the Pile, and an open source model called GPT Nero X. Yeah, I think I got it right. Okay. And the director of policy at Ulster is here in the room, so we can talk about that too. And then the last one are sort of the rights of data subjects, which I don't think really get covered, but it's the rights necessarily of having your representation in the data itself. So copyright holders and data subjects being separate people in this. This is maybe less of a issue with LLMs, but more of an issue when you're getting into things like image generation, in which images of people are taken and their likenesses are taken without consent. Okay, I tried to do that fast. I'm pass it on.
Yeah, I'll go next. Thank you. Actually, Alex did a great job of I think giving you all a very broad introduction to some of the main points, and I'll just add on. But let me first say, I am actually not a lawyer. Our lawyer here is sitting here next to me. I'm an information scientist, but I am primarily a privacy researcher. So a lot of what I am talking about comes through the lens of thinking about mostly consumer privacy in my work. And so just to add on a bit to the foundation that Alex beautifully set for us. So questions about proprietary data for large language models. Some of the questions that raises for me, again, are, as Alex had mentioned, you're mostly in that case thinking about data that companies have collected about you. And so what are the implications when they're building products based on that information? And in some cases, companies have had information on us for 10, 15, even 20 years. There's probably not an insignificant number of you in this room. If I asked you, when did you start first using Google? It might have been 2002, 2003. And so, you've had very long relationships in many cases with these companies. They know a lot about you unless they've been obligated to delete that data, over over amount of time. But a lot of cases they haven't. So we are thinking about, the extent to which they know a lot about us and what they can build based on that. Questions of transparency around that data and questions of reuse. And so one of the things we're seeing right now in the policymaking space, and this audience may know it better than a lot, being here in DC, there have been constant pushes for a federal level privacy bill. We never seem to quite get it over the finish line. ADPA or ADPPA, depending on what you say, was introduced last year. It hasn't yet been reintroduced in this Congress. But that bill digs very heavily into the fair information practice principles, and that's pretty much what also underlies the GDPR in Europe. So we're talking about concepts like data minimization and purpose specification. And so when you're thinking about proprietary data, a big question will be, you collected this data for one use, in some cases, maybe many years ago. These companies are going to want to reuse this data in ways that they didn't collect it for that purpose, to begin with. And I think one of the big policymaking questions will be, to what extent are we going to allow them to do that? Will they have to come back and ask us for consent every time they want to do something like that? Or do we kind of give them free rein to say, you collected this about me 15 years ago, and now we're going to repurpose it and put it in some, personalized prediction model about you. But I think another question around the proprietary data space is the market dominance it allows. And that is absolutely one of the things at the group I'm with at Stanford, that we've been pushing hard on is the idea that most of the actors you see in the AI space, and of course, the scraped data will raise, I think, another set of questions. But one of the reasons we see dominance in this sector by the big actors is not just that they're very well funded, but they're also sitting on giant troves of data. And so it also raises these competition and market dominance questions around when you allow them to aggregate so much data. What does that do to the larger marketplace in terms of like who can join in? And then also, I guess, and we're going to have questions of kind of who's represented in these data sets, I think on both piles of data that we're talking about. But I would say in the consumer context, you have one set of questions about how it's representative, what they're collecting data about, and what they're able to know about you and make inferences or make predictions about you. And again, that's mostly in a market-driven, capitalist context. So we're talking about products and services that are being built to offer you something of value, but obviously to offer something of value to the company. And so that very kind of market-based focus of data collection is very different than if you had data sets that were public and open for academic research, for example. And that is another, again, thing that we're pushing very hard at Stanford is the National AI Research Resource, which is one way we think into that problem, because one of the crises we see in academia is a lack of access, not only to compute, but also to data. And that's been a critical problem with AI research today. And so again, what we're seeing is a lot of resources put into this landscape of consumer data, proprietary data, where the outputs are not necessarily going to be things that make the world a better place, but make companies able to predict things about you more efficiently. And then just to go to the question of the scrape data, Alex, I think you raised some of the fundamental questions. I mean, this is data that's being collected about people without their consent. It really challenges these notions of what is public and what is private. And of course, at least here in the US, the assumption tends to lean on the side of if it's available, just the same as if I'm in a public place, I can photograph or film or record. If it's on the public facing internet, then I can take it. Of course, that's the first bump that we've seen with this has been with copyright, because obviously not all publicly accessible data on the internet is free for the taking. There are copyright issues. For privacy, this has been a much harder question because even right now, other than some very narrow cases where we've said, hey, if there are images of you, for example, taken by an intimate partner who have put those online, we now will subject those to, you don't have to put out a copyright claim to claim a harm in that case. But in most other cases, if let's say Alex takes a picture of me and then posts it on Twitter, X, whatever platform of the day we have, if Alex refuses to take it down, I don't own copyright in that image. So I can complain to X and ask them to remove it. But if Alex isn't willing to do it, then the platform has to get involved. And a lot of times those platforms don't want to be part of this debate. And so in many cases, there are images of us floating around that we may not want to be scraped and have shown up in large databases or models, but privacy is not the lever that we currently have to do anything about it. And copyright isn't that lever either. So there's also, I think, a bigger question about, Susan, I think, put out really a good list of standards like, accuracy of data, completeness, representativeness. When we're scraping the entire internet, we don't know. I mean, this is where I think we're operating from right now. We don't know what these companies are scraping. In some cases, they've been a little bit transparent, but there's no obligations right now for them to be transparent. And so we really don't know what's going into these very large models that are being developed, as the term that we use at Stanford, foundation models, things that we're going to build as foundations and put other things on top of. And my orientation to this comes not only from privacy, but earlier in my career, before I went into academia, I worked in trust and safety, before we called it trust and safety. And what I can tell you from that experience is that you get to see the absolute worst corners of the internet. And so I am here to tell you, a lot of people have seen a lot more as time has gone on. What we kind of view on the internet is really the tip of the iceberg. And there is a lot of data that we don't see that isn't mediated through search engines and such that we think is potentially being scraped and included in these models. And a lot of that content is not only of poor quality and, questionable veracity, but it's really toxic, and misogynistic and violent and so on. And so right now we are in the position where we are relying on these companies to essentially say, we'll essentially kind of buffer that, and we will train our models, to not output racist material, for example. But I would raise the question of whether, that should be part of the training data in most cases anyway. Like under what obligations should we have these companies place such that they should either, exclude some sources of data that we think are potentially, too harmful to be part of the data. And at that, I think I'll pause because I've definitely covered a lot of territory, but I would like to make sure that you can jump in now.
Okay. So Alex and Jenny have highlighted an awful lot of issues. I'm going to try not to be repetitive in talking about these. And maybe I'll just start by saying that I've kind of been working in relation to things like data governance and data scraping for many years now. And so it's interesting to see just how the issues have exploded around data scraping for artificial intelligence. They've existed for a long time, data scraping being a source of data. And I think that in this space around generative AI, these are issues all of these issues, privacy, intellectual property, data monopolies, data quality, they're all issues that we've seen for many, many years and have struggled with and grappled with for many years. We're now facing them at a completely unprecedented scale. And so, we didn't solve them before when they were at a smaller scale, and now we're really struggling to try to come to terms with them at larger scale. And they're often really I think some of the reasons we haven't been able to solve them before is because they're really quite complex, often complex public policy issues with arguments on multiple sides. So I'll try maybe and give some of that nuance as well. Obviously some of the dangers are information monopolies, and there's been a lot of talk. I think the panel has focused, and importantly so, on in terms of proprietary data on platform companies and the data that they hold. But there are other kinds of proprietary data as well that are relevant and that can also create important barriers to access and monopolies. So if you think of companies that have had privileged access over decades to resources like text, legal decisions, legal briefs, legal memoranda, you think of companies like LexisNexis and the proprietary resources that they have built, and the position that puts them in terms of developing generative AI or large language models for the legal context. That's another kind of proprietary model, I think, that is quite significant. And so the fact that some companies just in the course of other business carried out for years without thinking about AI have found themselves in positions where they sit on these immense proprietary resources, I think is an interesting one that we need to be thinking about. The limitations and under-inclusiveness, my co-panelists have already mentioned this with respect to platform data, for example, as a category of proprietary data. And so, these data are, these are vast stores of data, but they are, they do have important quality defects, important limitations. They are under-inclusive in some very significant ways. And there's also a significant lack of transparency. And I think all of these are dangers with that type of data. In terms of data scraping, data scraping obviously raises many of the same data quality issues. It can be under-inclusive. It can be very poor quality. Data scraping, can be uneven and can produce uneven quality data. It can also be snapshot oriented. So at the time of the scraping, or it may depend on how frequently scraping is repeated in order to update the data sets. It can create feedback loops as well. There are issues of bias and discrimination with scraped data that can be quite significant as well. There's a tremendous amount of hate, misinformation, discriminatory content online that can be scraped up in data scraping. And so the ways in which this kind of content can infect generative AI systems is also significant. Privacy has also been mentioned, and that's an enormous issue with scraped data and becoming a very complex and very significant one. We've seen a lot of concerns about copyright issues with scraped data. And these are ones that have existed for some time as well. And again, we're just seeing them on a much bigger scale. I want to also mention language and culture issues because I think those are important and complex as well. So on the one hand, the scraping of data off the internet will give you AI tools that are fed predominantly on English language resources. And this can create real differences in terms of what of the power and capabilities of tools in other languages. And that can raise some significant global equity concerns to the extent that these are going to become tools. It also may make those tools in other languages less accurate or less effective. Translation tools in some languages are simply not very good at all, whereas they are improving much more rapidly in more dominant languages. So those are significant language issues, but beyond that, but the solution is not necessarily to go out and scrape stuff from other languages and try to build those tools as quickly as possible, because I think there are increasingly important cultural and linguistic sovereignty issues that are associated with some of the more fragile and threatened languages. And so, so that's another set of issues that I think we need to think about in terms of generative AI and some of the risks of use of generative AI. Some of the issues that we've talked about, privacy and intellectual property in particular, are ones in which there isn't actually a global consensus about what the rules are. Copyright, perhaps a little bit more, well, perhaps, yeah, I'll use little. You can substitute any adjective you want. I don't know. I'm not sure little is right, but a little bit more, there's a little bit more consensus perhaps than with privacy, but there's still real differences. The fair use test in the United States is not the same test that's used in other countries, although there is a convention that is meant to harmonize copyright to some extent. The tests are still different in different countries. Text and data mining exceptions are different in different countries, and some countries don't have them yet. So there's a lot of difference at the international level in terms of what is permitted, and yet scraping is just a global practice and may not take into account. And this you really see in the privacy context, where the privacy laws outside the United States are very different from those inside the United States. And many of the biggest data scrapers are based in the United States and are scraping merrily away. And I can just give you the example of Clearview AI and its steadfast insistence that what it did was perfectly legal in the face of decisions of privacy commissioners from around the world that what it did was perfectly not legal. And the stalemate that we're starting to see with respect to different damage awards and decisions and judgments against Clearview AI for its practices. And so I think that you'll see this across the board as well, that there really isn't that consensus internationally about what can be scraped in terms of whether it's in terms of copyright or in terms of privacy, or what can be done with the data, or what conditions need to be in place with respect to the data. So yeah, I think I'll stop there because we've got lots of other questions to talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much to the panelists for our answer there. We've seen these answers touch on a bunch of different problems, concerns about data quality, data privacy, the ethical use of the data, how we build these data sets, and the many kinds of issues that come with that. The next question is, though, it's more acknowledging the idea that people are going to be building these technologies, building data sets to do this training now. So my question to the panel is, what are the key considerations AI developers should keep in mind when they're developing the data sets being used to train these models? I'm particularly interested in this question because I'm teaching data collection and manipulation next semester at the iSchool at Maryland. So I would love to have good answers to take up from students about how we do this now, given the new world we're in. Who knows? start with Dr. Scott.
It's for me, okay. So now I've got to quickly say everything there is. No, so yeah, maybe. So data quality, I think, is a big one right from the start. Like that data quality, and data scientists will say this as well, and have been saying it for decades. Garbage in, garbage out. Your data has to be of good, robust quality in order to produce good, robust results. And we've heard from the responses to the first question, lots of examples how the data sources and the available data or the techniques used to extract that data can create real issues with data quality. So I think I would say data quality is a very significant piece. Concerns about bias and discrimination are not exaggerated in the AI space. There is real and devastating potential for AI systems and generative AI systems as well to be infected with bias in some of the ways in which they operate. If you think about chatbots and the ease with which you can interact with some of these systems, there are concerns about them, even fooling people into thinking they're interacting with other human beings. But I think there are real risks that bias and discrimination will simply be fed back to people in ways that make it difficult to process and detect and understand. And I think these are enormous and potentially devastating risks. And so attention to bias and discrimination is a must. Related to both quality and bias and discrimination, obviously, is proper documentation and pedigree for data, that you have to know what data you have, where it comes from, what its limitations are, what its currency is, all of those sorts of issues. And so that would be another issue, I think. Another emerging issue, which is more complex, but you're starting to see it, and it's an ethical issue, which is giving back, the ethics of data use, and the idea that there may actually be some responsibility towards the sources of the data that you are gathering and using in applications. And now in some cases, the sources of the data are incredibly widespread and it's the whole world, and the facile response is, well, it's a free chatbot, so you're good. But in other cases, the data is very particular data, and it's taken from particular communities, and it may be, for example, I gave the example of fragile or threatened languages, for example, where you can easily trace the data back to particular communities. And so I think thinking about the ethics of data use, the need perhaps for permission, the need to be inclusive, to capacity build, to give back to communities where you are using data, are things that also should be taken into account. I'll stop there.
So I'll add the question of data provenance, which I know you touched on a little bit. I think the more I think about this space, the more I think we are likely to move towards something resembling supply chain transparency. The same way we want to know who produced our clothes or where the components came from. I predict in the regulatory space, we're going to move more towards the same type of supply chain transparency with data in this space. And I think, I'm glad you brought up Clearview AI. Just to give you, we may come back to this throughout maybe the whole session, but just to level set for those of you who aren't familiar with Clearview AI, because I think it's a great example. So Clearview AI is a company based here in the US that is building a tremendously massive database of facial images. And they're using that technology to market and sell to law enforcement, to build tools so that law enforcement can simply, grab an image off social media, let's say of a potential suspect, and have or in real time, take an image of somebody and have the system identify who that person is. And it is all built on scraped data, as far as we know. And in fact, in their tribulations with the European regulators, who, as Teresa has said, have pushed back very hard on Clearview's business model, one of their defenses has been like, we can't possibly sort out who is from where. Basically, we don't know where we got the data. And in some cases, It's my understanding they may have not scraped the data directly. It may have been come to them from other vendors, but essentially like we have a bunch of photos. We can tell you kind of who they are, but we don't actually know where these people are from or where they're, so how do we pull out the Italians and the Germans and everybody else from this data? So that's been their defense. And I would call that very willful ignorance. If I even believe that they don't have metadata or anything else that could help them solve this problem. So just to say, like, this idea that we just can't tell you where we source the data, I think is probably going to come to an end very quickly. I, being in California, pay very close attention to our new California Privacy Agency and the ongoing legislation we have in California, which is going, we have several pieces of new privacy legislation that is going through the rulemaking process that does still stand as probably the strongest set of privacy law in the US. And in the most recent rulemaking, the rules around automated decision-making, which will cover AI, also they've expanded some of the scope to say essentially like you need to tell us where you get your data from. So we're already seeing, at least in California, a push towards coming up with some of these rules to say like we will not accept these excuses that you just don't know where it comes from. And so I think we'll see the same questions around consent. If you're going to have a database of personal information about people, do you actually have their consent? Do you have that on record? So all of this to me starts to push towards, and we'll talk about this, I presume, in the kind of problem solving solution of like, how do we start trying to encourage these things either through regulation or through incentives? Because one of the things I've said repeatedly about Clearview and their business model is that frankly, it makes economic sense. Like, of course they're doing it the way they've done it. Like there's nothing that stops them. And where else would you get that data? And why would you pay for it if you can just take it for free? Like all the incentives are in the favor of what they're doing. So if we're going to stop that, we can obviously just say you can't do that, but how do we also address those market incentives? Because that's, I think, another piece of the behavior. Because again, because we see such market dominance by the big companies and their ability to capitalize that, if you're a startup trying to build an AI system, where are you going to get the data from? So of course you're going to scrape it if you can scrape it, because that's the free and easy way to get it. So if we don't address that, I think we're missing a big piece of the problem.
No, thank you so much. So this question, let me put the problematic of this question a little more starkly. So this question asks, where should AI developers consider when creating or merging data sets for training LLMs? So LLMs require huge amounts of data to train from scratch. And I would say that if we're posing to people in this room, unless you work for Google or Meta, or you're part of some consortium that, like the one Yassine put together for Blooms and Big Science, or Yulthor, like you're probably not training one from scratch. But to do one from scratch requires immense scale. We're just talking about orders of magnitude that are just quite large. And if we're trying to think about this, I want to think about this I wanted to approach this question because the question is directed at developers, but it's also in a way implicitly directed at regulators and how you are going to hold certain people accountable. So both Teresa and Jen mentioned documentation, and the kinds of documentation that we need just to know what we have are actually quite hard to gain, right? There's many different documentation frameworks. I pulled up a paper I co-authored with one of the fellows at there, Milagros Miceli, on the different kinds of documentation frameworks. And in the paper, we talked about 6 different documentation frameworks. There's more now. The kind of most referent one is datasets for data sheets, but also there's a few different ones, as in Stuart Geiger's, Emily and Bender and Batya Friedman's, Holland's Dataset Nutrition Project. And all of these are different kinds of ways of addressing different parts of, as Jen mentioned, the data set supply line. And so I like to think of these, and I won't bore you by listing these. You can read these papers yourself as a referent, and they've been used in different kinds of policymaking domains. But the things that are important in this is these things, I want to talk about the way that these things operate and at what they should operate as. They shouldn't necessarily operate as checklists. even though they have a checklist kind of vibe to them, they do also, it is about using them as a thinking tool of what you're doing with the data set and how to be reflexive about it. I'm going to make a bit of a dig here at Ulthur. They have a very good data sheet about the pile, but many of the ways that these things are described in the pile are about, let's take private information that's in the data set. The way that it's sort of described in the data set is, well, as Jen mentioned, this is kind of nuclear view defense. Some of the things when it comes to private information in the pile, well, these things were already private when we collected them. That's not an acceptable answer. As someone that's hosting the data set, training models on the data set, there's still going to be some kind of way as a data distributor that that private information gets trafficked, trained, and then downstream finds its way in different models, right? And so in thinking about this is how you think about the different domains of this. So I want to set that out there. The second particular part of data set creation that I want to highlight that hasn't been mentioned yet is the labor embedded in the data sets. And so by labor, I'm referring to a few different things. One, the labor that's needed to do any kind of annotation, cleaning, the dirty trust and safety work Jen referred to, of looking at the gross score, racism, sexism, CSAM content on the web, and doing that hard work. And this has been reported in Time and The Guardian and in many different places about how this data is typically gets foisted on to folks in the global South for very low wages, right? And so if we can think about it quite literally as an analog to the way that we think about data supply lines in clothing and different kinds of responsible sourcing about who's been laboring on those data, and also who's had the ability to push back when these data, kind of get the kind of aspects of the data get drilled down and just called data quality, but data annotators may not be given the power to actually say that the way that you're even framing this question doesn't make sense. We are looking at these data every day. We have the ability to actually change what you're focusing on and think about this collaboratively. The last thing I want to mention is also not only how we think about creating of large language models, is also if we're doing any kind of work that is trying to sort large language model data in a certain kind of way, there is also a type of labor that goes into how we categorize these different things. This is more relevant when we think about things like image data or what is an image or how different images are represented. And I think about this when we're thinking about images like image data sets like ImageNet, where many of the categories in ImageNet are sortings of the ImageNet have very objectionable categories, or rather they did until about 2 years ago, in which there was a piece by Kate Crawford and Trevor Pagland that uncovered a lot of this. Now, I want to highlight this because we don't often think about this as a potential pitfall, but we find any kind of categorization that might be happening as a potential place where there are types of vectors that are ripe for abuse. And I think in large language models that often comes to the fore and kind of probably too late in the process when we're doing things like red teaming, when we're doing things like identifying particular types of biases. We think about these often in a US frame of racism or sexism, but we don't often think about the ways in which they talk about different types of conflicts. So for instance, we don't talk often about testing for caste bias. And as Teresa mentioned, these are really poorly talked about outside of the US context. If you were doing this kind of testing for language models in Hindu or Tamil, you would have to be doing the kind of signifiers that we're testing for this. But yet, we've seen any kind of transparency reports which of red teamers, there have been none, but we've seen at least the reports that have come out of social media, how many social media content moderators that we've finally seen under the Digital Services Act. Those for non-Western languages are nil to none. So that's also a vector that we need to think about.
Thank you very much. So we've got some answers on this about data quality, data provenance, the ethics, and giving back. I want to touch on Dr. Hannah's answer about training from scratch. This is a great point, because like what this really means is many people are using these foundation models and doing fine tuning, and then relying that the underlying model that they're going to fine tune has been done well. It doesn't have these problems. So it just amplifies this problem for us. And I will definitely go back to my students with the data sheets perspective. And this question about what we can do from a policy perspective sets us up for the next, or these points about what we can do from a policy perspective sets us up for the next question, which I think is super important, because if we are having employees who are like the bottom line developers that you're coming in to have do these fine tuning models or fine tuning these models, and they're being asked to do something that they are uncomfortable with, or that is potentially objectionable, what recourse do they have to go to their bosses and say this is wrong? Or that they'll just be fired and somebody else will be hired to do this work, right? So this next question is, what is one key idea that you think the government could employ to encourage the development of data sets that are more accurate, more complete, safer, and more representative than what we do? I think we'll start with Dr. King in the middle to give some variance here.
So there's a couple of different ways to answer this question. I'll start with this. I mean, I think it's important that from a competitiveness angle, for example, we think about public funding for data, not just for research purposes, although that would be huge. In fact, Stanford's been a big supporter of the Create AI Act, which would establish, again, the National AI Research Resource, the NAIR. That's legislation that's sitting with Congress right now, but it's a very sizable financial commitment, I think in the range of something like $4 billion. But that's seen as a potential kind of kickstart for both supporting AI research in universities. I mean, even Stanford, which is, arguably one of the wealthiest universities in the world, the faculty I know will say very, bluntly, like, we could not create a chat GTP or GPT here. Like we don't have enough, we don't have the resources to create technology like that. Because you just simply, again, it's not just the compute, it's also the data. So the NAIR is one solution. I know in Canada, there's Compute Canada. I don't know if that's being used as an AI resource per se, but a similar type of investment in, with kind of public funding for data. And I do think, I think it depends on where you want to focus. Like we could argue about, trying to make the startup ecosystem more fair so other people can get a leverage in. But I would argue that we're really falling behind in the capacity of academia to do the basic scientific research on AI that you would like to see more of, again, because the resources aren't there. And industry can pay so well, and not just money. I mean, some of it is the money, but part of it is the access to these resources. And Alex, you may have more to say on that too. But if you're, if you are trying to retain faculty in AI at research universities, but you cannot give them basically the tools to play with, you don't end up with a lot of options. So that's definitely, I think, one kind of looking across the whole sector would be one thing that we can do, at least in the US in the short term. I believe there are other countries that have already, again, are making this type of investment because they see that it is a really critical issue. There's other things I would add to that list, but I'm going to just stop there and discuss it more in the Q&A.
I can go next. No, I mean, Jen brings up some really excellent points, and just thinking about consortia of compute and what that would entail. I'm often thinking about data sets along the creation of different data sets. In a paper that Bernie Koch and Remy Denton, Jacob Foster and I did, we looked at data sets being used in benchmarks. We found that 50% of the use of benchmark data sets, sorry, I'm going to phrase this, it's a little funny. 50% of the use of benchmark data sets is concentrated in only 12 data sets. Of those 12 data sets, 10 of them are US based, one is German based, and one is Chinese based. And they're being used far and beyond the original task that they were intended for. And so what would it mean to actually have data sets that are created by a multiplicity of organizations beyond, beyond Stanford and beyond CMU and beyond Berkeley and Princeton and New York University, and the ones that have the big AI labs. So one of the things I could imagine, which would go along with kind of a public AI resource, maybe a public data resource, or something that has some kind of infrastructure around it that may be housed at, and that is encouraged by some kind of public mechanism. They're housed at NIST or something of that nature, in which there could be changes that are auditable, people who could have a low barrier of entry of getting involved beyond people who are typically only have the resources to engage. I don't know if I know exactly of models like that, but I think that could be one thing. I mean, I'm kind of thinking like a public version of the pile, to be honest, and one that has documentation that is evolving and has as well resourced. Because from what I know of, when I asked for the data sheet for the pile, Stella Biderman told me I was the first person to ask for it. And that's a problem. So if we had that documentation that is rich and evolving, I think that could be a big boon.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to continue in this trend because top of my list is data governance, and I think one of the things that there are a couple of things broadly that I think are interesting about that, and about the fact that data governance related issues were raised by the other panelists as well. One is that there's a tremendous amount of attention and energy being put into AI regulation right now, and arguments about the AI Act in Europe. In my own country, we're agonizing over the AI and Data Act, which is before Parliament. There are other AI regulation, and there's a lot of talk about risk regulation and so on. So there's a lot of energy going into AI regulations, and I think it's interesting that the solutions that we're coming up with here are about data governance, which is something we've been talking about again for decades, and working on for decades. And many people have been quietly working away on data governance issues for decades. So we've had, since the early 2010s, a lot of interest on the part of governments, or growing interest on the part of governments in the open data movement and making open data available to support innovation and so on. But there are limits to open data and to open government data. Certainly, it's a format that doesn't lend itself to governing data that are more sensitive, either in terms of because they're personal data, or there's a potential for re-identification if they're anonymized data sets, or because there's community sensitivities, or because of how the data have been gathered. And so for those categories of data, I think we need to, and we have been thinking about better ways to govern them in the public interest, to support innovation, to support research. And so some of those have been commons-based governance ideas. Some of them have been research and university-based governance models. And so I think we just need to put more energy and more resources into that. And certainly one of the things that I've seen with data governance models is either a lack of funding or a lack of sustainable funding. In other words, you get a big grant to set up this great data infrastructure for sharing data and in a safe and responsible way, and it runs out after 5 years. And the expectation is somehow magically you're going to become self-sustaining after 5 years, and you're not. And so all that work and effort falls apart. So I think we need to be thinking about and what governments can do better support for sustainable data governance initiatives, better funding for data governance and for data infrastructures, for data sharing, a shift from purely open government models to license-based models, because it is in those license-based models that you can set certain permissions and certain limitations on the data set. Along with that, of course, you have to have resources for enforcement. And this has been an issue in the past where you have fairly high-minded data licenses that allow for only certain uses and so on. And you have a nonprofit administering them that simply doesn't have the resources to go to court if anyone breaches them. So there has to be, some thought given to how you would support and enforce those licenses. And those are the kinds of frameworks that also can manage community involvement and give back, whether it's in the context of smart cities, for example, and the governance of smart cities data, where you have some sort of give back to the community and community involvement in the data governance principles, or if it's in the context of Indigenous data sovereignty movements, or in other such contexts, these are the frameworks that allow you to try and build those principles into how data are shared ethically and responsibly, and curated as well to ensure quality. So yeah, that would be on my wish list.
All right, thank you very much. That's going to end now with the segment where I ask questions. We've had opportunity to talk about what the problems are. I know there are many. We've had opportunities to talk about how the front end AI developer has to deal with these issues and what they can do. And we've talked now about what governments ought to do to help incentivize safer and more robust data sets and technology. Now I want to open up the floor to you, the audience. And to do that, what I'll ask you to do is say there are mics in the ceiling, though I will ask you to please, and there's a mic who will run around. So please stand to ask your question. And when you are given the microphone, say your name, affiliation, and then ask your question. Here.
I have a question. Go ahead over there.
So I've been involved with applied. Yeah, sorry. I'm Michael Runewolf. I am a PhD student and researcher on natural language processing. Are there any good toolkits, policy toolkits, in which with best practices? And I'm working on a research project with Mila in Montreal, and there is interesting stuff in Canada, but we're also doing international research and trying to work if there's any kind of toolkits you're aware of out there. Like not literal toolkits, obviously, but guidelines that which applied researchers can follow.
Is it from the panel about policy toolkits, or
Maybe you just gave me the topic for my next white paper. It's literally because, well, I would actually, Alex has not plugged her paper that I really love, which is a framework for data set accountability, which I think is a great introduction to this whole space, and a good kind of summary, I think, of or at least state of the art a year ago, right? But there's this growing list of different organizations and different approaches. I mean, Alex mentioned data sheets. There's a lot of different things that are emerging. What I've been telling policymakers is, because I've been asked, like, well, so what do we do? What do we regulate? And I'm like, it's a little early, honestly. Like, people are still trying to figure this out. But it is it's a challenge to keep track of like everything that's beginning to kind of bubble up in this space. I would start with Alex's paper, honestly. And then there are different things, but I don't think there's a centralized kind of repository right now of like the different things you can do, because I think this is still really an open question, even in a place, even thinking about Europe with, obviously the AI Act is still in negotiation, literally, I think this week right now. And even looking to something like the GDPR, there isn't a clear-cut answer what to do about the data piece of all this. But there are some folks out there who are beginning to try to aggregate some of the existing or emergent tools. And so you would do good, I think, to start with Alex's paper. And there have been some other things, I think, that have come up in the last year that there's now Data Commons, I think, is one of the recent websites that are data provenance. Anyway, like I said, it's really literally an emergent space. But unfortunately, I don't think there's a shortcut. And I don't know if you have anything you would add as well. It's like a shortcut source to like, here's your policy toolkit. I don't think it's out there yet. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mike. We have a question. Yes, we have a question in the back.
Yes. My name is Scott Grossman. I'm a data scientist with a company called OneCall. We operate some some call centers, so we get a lot of call recordings that we are now looking at transcripts. So a two-part question. Well, first off, I'm going to say we're not going to be training any large language models, but we are using large language models, and we're exploring how we can use those to kind of better understand our data. So the first is around disclosure from when people call us and we record. Has there been any thought about whether you need to amplify the disclosure we give today, which is this call is being recorded for quality assurance purposes, to something like this may be used for model training or anything like that? We do collect a lot of call transcripts. And then the second is similar to the first question about toolkits. So we're not going to be training any models, but we do prompt engineering, and we do some referral augmented generation where we're taking conversations and other data, creating embeddings, and then searching, and then using large language models to interpret, to kind of consolidate that. So anything that you see specific in terms of framework for those use cases where you're taking your data and through prompt engineering or other methods, then leveraging a large language model. So we don't know what the large language model, it's just a black box to us, but we know our data, any kind of recommendations in that space.
I'll jump in on number one, at least. I don't think I can answer number two. On number one, in the US, I don't think right now you are obligated to give people an opt-out, but I think you would be wise to consider when I hear that recording, if you would prefer to not have your data used for these purposes, press 1, before you get connected. We've seen, there was a very high publicized case with the crisis text line last year, and the revelation that, those recordings were being used for AI training, and some very, thorny issues of consent and concern about the appropriateness of that. I mean, customer service is maybe less emotional, less related to people's, unless you're really frustrated, right? But I'm thinking explicitly right now about both the California and Colorado regulations, which I don't think would demand that you give people that opt-out, but I would think companies would be wise to consider and potentially offer that proactively, because I wouldn't surprise me if we see a shift towards requiring you to give people opt-outs where possible.
If I could just add quickly, it's certainly in Canada, you would have to get consent for both purposes, or you would have to provide notice of both purposes, and not just the quality assurance purpose. I just recently learned that when you're on hold, anything you say is also sucked into that void. And so you should, ideally, I'd like to have the notice say, oh, and if you're going to start talking about your personal affairs with your members of your family while you were sitting on hold, that's also being recorded for quality assurance purposes and for the training of AI. But anyway.
Phone, please, during the whole.
Yeah.
We have one more question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Anand Steven. I'm a civil engineer with Gannett Fleming. My question revolves around like high-risk professional services like engineering. So our services are bound by licensure. Yet there's like a lot of egregious decisions that have been made by using data, running a freeway through neighborhoods that we should not have done 50 years or so. But now it's conceivable that we can have a solution that's determined from an AI model. What kind of frameworks that you would suggest for professions like mine that we can start looking at, put the guide rails in place?
I can try to take a stab at this. I mean, it seems like there's some of this. I don't think there's any mature professional frameworks on this right now, but it would seem that any kind of licensure within a field needs to meet the kind of, the kind of necessitation, basically would necessitate the same kind of approvals or same kind of showing about how you would minimize risk in whatever domain it would be. I would say that if you're using a black box AI model, without kind of known failure modes for that particular domain, that seems very worrisome. So if there's a construction of a set of framework, it would have to prove kind of through some testing that would have to come about. The problem though is that, I mean, that just the kind of evaluation schemes for, let's say, large language models are not even really set or stable yet. So to even say that there's a profession-specific use of it that needs to meet some guideline means that, well, we're not even there yet because of the kind of newness of the evaluation and where we are with evaluation. That's kind of where I'm seeing it right now, and I don't know how that matures, but there needs to be much more evaluation, general purpose evaluation before we even get to professional use.
Is it something we can borrow from medical field? I know that they use quite a bit. So there's some.
There's been some analogs from the medical field, the medical device field, discussions of things like having an FDA for data, which I'm a little skeptical of, but you know, there have been indications. Former colleague of mine, Andy Smart, and Deborah Raji, who's a student at Berkeley, have a paper that's on internal auditing and kind of lessons that they've come from medical devices in aviation. But that's more for post hoc auditing of models rather than data themselves.
I think most people would point you to the NIST AI risk framework, but I don't, my critique of risk frameworks is simply that I think they make a lot of sense for the business or the enterprise that's using them, but I don't know to what extent they really capture anything beyond kind of the business liability. Like if that happens to also include your customers and their concerns, great. Then it goes more than just your boundaries. But if that doesn't, you know, I think the NIST framework kind of urges you to think outside your box, but you're not required. So, you know, that's where I get concerned that there's just not enough kind of teeth behind just thinking about risk.
So we have a question in the back, and then we'll have a question up here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Carolina Rossini. I'm the co-founder of the DataSphere Initiative and like a professor at Boston University. So actually, I want to make a contribution to what Michael was asking. At the DataSphere Initiative, we have published an atlas called the Atlas of the Datasphere, where we mapped over 400 organizations working in this space. And we are actually launching an update of that, which is going to be more interactive with over 600 organizations working in this space. Many of them do have accountability frameworks and roadmaps frameworks. Some of them including have AI assessments and data governance assessment tools with the public interest in mind, which I think is very interesting because you can use assessments as a roadmap for policy development if you kind of change a little bit how you read it, right? And of course, I also want to mention KIDP here in DC. They have AI assessment that they've been working with governments around the world to develop their AI policies. And of course, a lot of startups in the space have been developing accountability assessments like Credo AI here in DC and Seattle. I think they are doing a good job on that. So just that some examples of a lot of resources out there that are being consolidated exactly because things have been so siloed for such a long time. We need to bring things together. So yeah, happy to contribute with that.
Thank you.
We have a question up here in the front.
Can I just ask a favor of everybody, please? Ask questions, don't give statements. I really want this to lead to some policy advice.
Should I just ask it or is there a mic?
There's a mic.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much. And I'll keep this as a question. Dr. King, you mentioned that with regard to some of these, disagreements, discussions online, the quote, the platforms don't want to be a part of the debate. That raised in my mind the issue of Section 230. they don't have to be part of the debate or, you know, because they have this legal immunity. And you also mentioned that, for example, one of the things that's brought Clearview into better focus has been the various litigation brought against it. But, you know, the platforms, the big ones, Facebook, et cetera, have that 230 immunity. Being Washington, what do you all think about that?
So my challenge with 230 is I think that it's being used as a shield right now against pushing platforms to make kind of any structural changes. And so I'm not anti 230 per se. I mean, I think the speech issues it raises are you know, absolutely essential. But a lot of my focus right now has been on kind of kids and technology and kids and social media. And when all we do is go in circles about content and try to talk about the design of technology in such a way that it gets reduced to speech, that every design decision becomes an expression of speech, I feel like that's bad faith, honestly. And so there's a difference between kind of mediating these interpersonal, like Alex posts the picture of me. It's right, you know, the platforms don't want to get involved in those kind of interpersonal disagreements, but there should be some recourse in many cases if there's content about me that I want to challenge. And I would say one way to think about this is maybe with a fiduciary kind of duty of care idea, in the sense of, for the most part, the platforms kind of put this infrastructure out and basically say, go at it, people. You know, we'll enforce some rules of the road, and especially when it's things like illegal content where we have to enforce it. But for the most part, like, we don't want to get involved. But clearly people experience real world harms from the interactions they're having. And so I would say that my solution or my angle on this is that there's been a lot that we've kind of assumed was covered by 230 that doesn't really account for, again, the real world harms people are experiencing from these interactions, and that there are structural things we could ask the platforms to do to change the way they interact. Because, you know, if anything, we know as more kind of transparency demands have been made, for the most part, design is being dominated by money. I mean, by monopolizing attention, you know. So social media is not being designed with our best interests in mind. It's being designed to make money. And so unsurprisingly, when you have a tool that focuses, you know, predominantly on making money, you're not necessarily helping people in a pro-social way kind of deal with some of these problems. So I don't think the answer is to get rid of 230, but I do think that 230 has been a shield, and that the courts have been, unfortunately, very easy to lead down this path into thinking that everything in here is a speech issue. And I'd argue a lot of this is about design and technology and about infrastructure, and it's not a speech issue, and that there are things we could do.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, it is on. I'm Yasin. I'm at Hugging Face, and I was one of the organizers of the Big Science project. Going back to the data governance from the developer perspectives, we have lots of amazing ideas for our suggestions for how it should be done. And we have developers who mostly need to be first to market yesterday. How do you all manage that strategically? Is that something where you've had choices that you want to present? Like
on the incentives?
On the incentives and managing the timelines of different people.
So easy just to say these things and then to be asked for the solution is a very different thing. So I will just throw something out there. And of course, if anybody else wants to jump in too, since I raised the incentives question, my kind of thinking on this issue, I think a lot about consumer data. So this may not work, you know, outside of consumer data. I feel like we're at the point where the infrastructure, I don't know if we should call it infrastructure, but the model of our data is collected by other entities, and we basically lose it. We lose control of it. You know, like all we can do is claw it back or make requests to delete, but it's this kind of default data is collected by default model that I would say, you know, rules our landscape, which, goes back 20, 30 years to the birth of the commercial internet and companies basically being told or making the argument, if you ask us, if we have to ask people for their permission before we collect data, like our businesses will not take off. I mean, that was really where we were in like 2000, 2005. And so here we are, 15, 20 years later in an internet where companies collect by default and don't ask permission. And now, surprise, we've seen, that we've seen giant data, monopolizations occur. I would flip it on its head. And I think that, again, I don't know if this would work outside of the consumer data space. I do think there is a B2B market that's growing in the space of things like data trusts and data collectives. And again, trying to rethink this whole data ecosystem. In the consumer data space, this is where I think about it the most in terms of, I would like to see us not own our data. And that's how this often gets framed. It gets talked about as data ownership, but one where we control it using technology. And as somebody who is, schooled in user experience in a way where I don't spend an hour a day thinking about who collects my data, because nobody wants to do that. I can't even organize my damn photos, let alone think about, how many companies are collecting my data. I would flip this whole kind of script on its head and say that we can use different forms of technology to control our data, and we can license it back to companies. And maybe we gain a profit from it, maybe we don't. But instead of it just being collected from us, and God knows where it is, and you'll never keep track of it again, I don't know. And this is actually, Teresa, you may have thought about this. I don't know if this is a DRM world where we had so many debates about DRM 20 years ago. Like, are we thinking about DRM for personal data? Like, is that a solution in this space around licensing and being, I don't know if that changes the scraping equation, but this is just where I've wondered if that would help with the incentives question. It could make things much more complicated, but just that's one way I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, there are different models being contemplated. There's something that's something that is contemplated for launch in Ontario, for example, around health information, which would be to allow, this is a publicly funded healthcare system, so allow private sector health information intermediaries to be a collection point for personal health information for consumers, and then the consumers would be able to direct how that information is further used, so that intermediary becomes a kind of broker who brokers whether information is used for research or shared with a physiotherapist or shared with whoever. And so it gives more control, and it also allows for greater use of data. But the cynic in me also knows that because anonymized data is considered out of scope of the health information protection legislation, that those intermediaries are also going to be anonymizing the crap out of that data and selling it for research without the individual's consent. But there you go. It's complicated, but I do think there are those models that are starting to emerge, and people are exploring this idea of how individuals could better manage their personal data for a variety of different purposes.
One comment, well, I just have one kind of thought, because this is more of kind of like offering more of a carrot and a stick kind of thing. So I'm thinking about this often with annotation of data, where data quality becomes kind of reduced to, which different data workers can do the task better. But then that results not in actual better data quality. It's just that who can sort of game these really poorly written annotation documents, right? So if you had actually, this gets less on your scrape data. This is more if you're doing your annotations, but what are things that can be produced in collaboration with annotators in a way? There was a New Yorker intelligence article kind of about this kind of way that it was kind of it had something like Scale AI was looking to get away from like MTurk and kind of commercial ways of generating annotations, and more looking for expert annotations in a way of you're just cooperating more with your workers to have better data. And that itself makes such a product much further along, especially if you're getting in particular types of subject areas. And so you're having a better offering for one, but then it might also only be in certain kinds of subfields. So it might be you're only looking at, medical, or you're looking at health, rather than something as general purpose as GPT or ChatGPT. So that's one thing. And then I guess the other, but then the stick part of it is, well, then you have your whole thing that we've been talking about here. So is it copyright liability? Is it, so having, I don't think that itself is going to be sufficient as an incentive, right? You need to offer something as a better consumer offering. So that might be a kind of way of thinking about that.
All right, so while we're technically at time, so thank you all so much for your continued engagement. Susan's given me the green light to go 5 more minutes. So we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So we have one in the back, and then we'll do this gentleman in the blue up here in the front.
Hi, I'm Sayesh Kapoor from Princeton University. So one area where we have some amount of consensus among civil society, academics, researchers, and so on, is transparency. Everyone broadly agrees on the need for transparency. And yet it seems like an under sort of utilized mechanism. For instance, in the White House executive order, transparency, the only part where transparency comes in, even tangentially, is on the results of red teaming efforts. There's no transparency requirements on the data, models, and so on. One theory that's been floated around is that the reason this happens is because of First Amendment issues, and that transparency would be compelled speech. So my question to all 3 panelists is, to what extent are First Amendment concerns guiding the lack of transparency by these tech companies? So just like Section 230, is it the case that companies can sort of stand behind this First Amendment compelled speech sort of argument to argue against compelled transparency? And are there ways to get around that?
So the big caveat, I'm not a lawyer. But I will just say, I mean, with the executive order, I mean, obviously they can't, the scope is limited, right? Because it's not a mandate for the commercial sector. But I think there's been questions around procurement and whether government procurement can raise those precise issues. And executive order was very long, so I can't remember off the top of my head if it explicitly dealt with that. But I mean, the proposed Algorithmic Accountability Act from Wyden's office last session, which, unfortunately didn't even, I think, make it to the floor, basically gave the FTC the power to look across all the different kind of transparency reporting, but kept those secret by default. Like, they were not going to be posted publicly. And so, I mean, I think that's one way that's being negotiated, but is it a question of, if we mandate public transparency reporting, will it get pushed? Again, not being a lawyer, I would think trade secrets is probably the most active angle. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody tries to make a First Amendment argument at this case. I feel like the First Amendment is become incredibly expansive most recently, but I don't know.
Yeah, I would just say that it's not really, I mean, I find that it's a really interesting comment. The issues in around transparency in the EU or in Canada, for example, or other jurisdictions wouldn't be framed as speech issues, but there's still a resistance to transparency. And that's in part because of trade secret concerns and really kind of very rampant, very broad trade secret concerns, but also in part because of the effort, the time, the labor involved in being properly transparent and in providing for proper transparency. And so I think that those are both factors, especially with smaller and medium-sized companies, the questions of resources and doing all of the documentation and transparency that may be required. So there's resistance to it for that reason as well.
Thank you. We've got Neil here, who's been very patient in his waiting for.
Neil Wasserman, Computer Science at GW. Let's suppose you are able to solve the very difficult problem of untraining a data model. Removing a novel that I wrote from the data model. It's a hard problem. And let's say if you could have a test whether my great American novel was included in the large language model, what would be the prospect of a federal regulation requiring such a test and requiring responsive action on the part of the data model's owner?
I mean, those are some big what ifs.
Yeah.
Because both of those are not technically feasible really, with what we
Well,
have.
the second is
Of doing a test?
of doing a test as to, you could establish a probability that a particular set of data was included in a data model. I mean, I don't think that's that hard a problem. The first one is hard.
My colleague James Zhao at Stanford has, I think at least, I don't know, pragmatically, but theoretically worked on that issue. And I'm not in a position to evaluate how probable his research is. I'm sure you could, but he has advocated that you can delete data from a model without retraining. So I put that out there as something to look at. But I would think if we can demonstrate it could be done, then there would be no reason why a policy solution couldn't follow from it.
I mean, there is research being done on the first.
Right,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
No, the unlearning I know is an open area, but then picking a data point and I would challenge you on the second one too, because actually doing a test of that is not, I don't think, feasible. And unless you were trying to unless you were using a test that you knew it was in the model and you were trying to expose the training data by doing kind of prompt engineering. Anyways, this is very technical and whether the feasibility, I would say from the start, I mean, this is getting more into sort of what mechanisms you can use for opt out, which is kind of the problems that you saw with DALL-E 3, where OpenAI said that living artists could opt out from model training, but it's not clear to you if DALL-E 3 is already building on models from DALL-E 1 and 2, and you still have the problem of, and this is setting up the keynote now nicely, that there's still a whole bunch of generated data based on DALL-E 1 and 2 and Stability AI Midjourney already out there that is probably being ingested as a subsequent data product. So in some ways, the genie's already out of bottle, even if you held these two technical things as feasible.
So thank you very much. That leads us to the Ouroboros of the data that's training its own or training itself on the models that are being generated elsewhere. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panel.